Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We're going to get started shortly. We're going to give just another moment or two for folks to join us. So again, we'll begin very shortly. Please stay tuned. Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to A New Way Forward, Reimagining the Nonprofit Workplace Virtual Engagement Series, presented by the Council of Michigan Foundations, the Michigan Nonprofit Association, Michigan Community Resources, and COAC Detroit. We are so excited to have you here for what promises to be an engaging and interactive multi-part series designed to provide guidance to nonprofits throughout Michigan as you consider your new way forward. Today's session is focused on governance and what it means to be a board that is strategic, supportive, and equity-centered, especially now in this current reality. I'm Bridget McWiggin with the Council of Michigan Foundations, and I'll serve as your host and moderator today. Before we begin, we do want to express our appreciation to anyone returning from our past sessions of this series and extend a warm welcome to those who are joining us for the first time. We'll tell you a little bit about today's program and then we'll introduce our speakers. We have another great session planned for today as part of this series, and we're excited to hear from our presenters through conversation and through presentation, and we're eager to hear from you on the call as we open up opportunities to welcome your questions and invite your reflections through the chat box. Speaking of the chat box, let's briefly talk about just a few housekeeping notes as we get started. This webinar is being recorded so that the recording and the slides will be shared with you afterward. So if there are pieces that we referenced, know you'll have an opportunity to come back to those items. We do have built-in time for questions and answers. All of our participants are muted, so again, we encourage you to use the chat function for your questions and again for your reflections as well. We also want to encourage you to follow the chat throughout the presentation, where you'll find helpful tips, links, and the survey for the session before you exit. Our colleagues on the call will help to populate different things that we'll be referencing throughout our dialogue today. We also have a new function we're implementing for the first time after this session, what we're calling the lobby. Knowing that often after conference sessions that you attend, sometimes the conversation is just, you're eager to continue. And so after, we'll give you the capacity to enter the lobby where you can share and connect more informally. So essentially, when our official formal programming is done, you're welcome to stay on the line and we'll give you space to make connections and take you off of mute. So if you'd like to stick around after the session, we encourage you to do so. As you know, the information around COVID-19 is moving at a rapid pace. And so across all of our series sessions, we want to emphasize that because this is an ever-changing situation and we're all doing our best to understand and apply what we can, that our presenters are sharing guidance, not necessarily legal or financial advice, and that in a fast-moving situation, it's important to recognize that what we're sharing today is about this moment in time, and we're continuing to change rapidly throughout this situation and our response to the pandemic. I do lastly want to offer that in these times, as many of us continue to navigate the opportunities and challenges of working out of our home offices, we may see or hear pets and kids and other realities of life at home, along with the fun of unreliable internet connections at times. So we encourage you to have these moments when our special guests appear on screen or our videos might freeze briefly, to just let those be reminders of our common humanity and to share our support as we navigate our work from home life together in a continued way. So next, we just want to briefly preview what we have coming up in our series, and then we'll talk a little bit more about our program today. So you can see on your screen, we have 3 upcoming sessions and encourage you to attend: Planning for Your Nonprofit's Financial Health, Mergers, Collaborations, Dissolutions, and Asset Transfers, and Advocacy and Civic Engagement. So please stay tuned for those opportunities. Now let's go ahead and move into today's program. We are so grateful to have with us the amazing panelists that you see pictured here on the screen, and hopefully you can see them on video as well. So I'm going to briefly introduce our 4 panelists and then share a little bit more context for our session. So I'll ask our panelists if you want to give a wave as I'm introducing you. First, Yodit Mespin-Johnson, President and CEO of the nonprofit Enterprise at Work, or NEW. We have Eric Wimbley, CEO of Pretty Lake Camp. Randy Myers, President and CEO of the Community Foundation of St. Clair County. And Mark Lazat, attorney and shareholder from Butzelin Lawn. So thank you so much to our panelists. We're going to turn it to you in just a moment. So when our teams from CMF, M&A, MCR, and COAC launched this series, we knew that beyond purely lifting up issues related to the return to offices and workspace, it was critical we frame these conversations around the opportunity for nonprofits to find that new way forward. We collectively challenged the desire to go back to normal. Our sector understands we have broken and breaking systems and structures that maintain and exacerbate inequities, and we recognize the opportunity we all have as nonprofits to be change makers. We know this is an opportunity to step back and think differently about our work, recognizing each of us and each of our organizations is on a unique journey in that work. I know that's true for me, and that's true for CMF. We've invited the Michigan Community of Philanthropy over the course of the last year to consider, what does equity mean to you? What does it mean to our community as a whole? And we've reflected on where we've made progress, where we may have fallen short, and what our opportunities are to deeply and with intentionality put equity at the center of our work and live our values. So we won't be perfect, but we're committed to progress. We're also fortunate to have an exceptional group of trustees who, together with our CEO, are helping to lead and support that change. And I think that's something that we're all excited to talk about today, and the role of trustees in that process. And speaking of exceptional leaders, I'd now like to welcome our speakers again. And first, I'll offer to Yodit. We'd love to hear any opening comments that you'd like to share as you enter the space.
Hey, Bridget, thank you. And thank you for the team at CMF and with your partners for the invitation. I'm joining you in my living room in the occupied land of the Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, and Fox tribal lands. I'm also entering this space as mom of a young Black boy, as an activist, as you mentioned, as the CEO in a sector that is once again facing our country's deepest and most complex challenges, and has its own flaws. I'm entering this space as a board member myself and as a Black woman. I'm also entering this space with this kind of existential question we've been asking at New and asking of our community, which is, in the height of a global pandemic, in the height of a lack of national leadership, and in the height of our country and nation's most recent uprisings around race and injustice, the question we've been asking is, what have we learned that must and will transform us as individuals, organizations, and as a community? So I'm happy to talk about and be joined by my esteemed colleagues to discuss what it means to reimagine governance. And I appreciate being here.
Thank you so much, Yodit. Eric Wimbley, I'd love to turn it to you.
Sorry, Bridget, can you come back to me next? I seem to have lost
Sure.
something on my screen here.
You bet. Randy, could I invite you to go next?
You may. Really honored to be here today. You know, I don't think any of us should underestimate our ability to make a difference. And I know that's kind of a saying that's been around a long time. But in times like this, I represent a place-based funder organization. We've been around 76 years. There is never a time to stop questioning your role in society, questioning your impact in society. And I think that's especially true of organizations that have assets to give away, because how we give away those assets and how we make a difference in our community reflects on our belief in our governance. I find this topic fascinating today because for us, we follow a model called generative governance, which might be new to many people. It's a premise developed largely by a professor named William Ryan. It prompts organizations to always challenge and question what they are doing and why they are doing it, and is it making a difference? So that's what I'm excited to talk about today. I feel our foundation was uniquely positioned to do well during these times because we've spent so many years challenging our own norms and our own positions. And we're willing to be criticized, and we're willing to criticize ourselves. And I think that's an important first step towards leadership, which is demonstrated by how we invest back in the community.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. Randy. Are we okay to turn it to you?
Yes, we are. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to participate. I am currently the CEO of a nonprofit that serves underserved youth and families in the Kalamazoo community area, but also serve on a couple of boards, one for addiction recovery and another for educational resources. I just felt it was important to share those because as I think about where we're all coming from and where we're all trying to get to, we wear multiple hats throughout working through these issues that exist and have existed for decades, if not longer. I entered this space feeling tested as a leader in my field and a person of color, yet weary from 50 years plus of battling for equality in education, housing, jobs, promotions, where all the battles I was involved in, I wasn't fully sure that I was involved in them. I was a little naive and making half steps in progress where I felt like I was should have been making full steps. So while I enter this space, battle tested and tired, and the battle goes on, hopefully we can make some strides. I'm hopeful that we can make permanent solutions out of these issues. And I'm interested in hearing and brainstorming ideas of how we move forward as EDs or staffers and approach with organizational sustainability as a priority and not the only major issue on the table. So that's what's at the top of my mind right now.
Thank you so much, Eric. And Mark, I know we're going to be digging into your presentation at the latter part of our conversation today, but before we jump into further conversation, anything you want to share as we get started?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this. From a professional point of view, I do a substantial amount of work with nonprofits. I enjoy it a great deal, and I feel very privileged because I learn from people who are doing wonderful things that I don't know anything about, and you know, that brings a great deal of satisfaction to me. From a personal point of view, my background and the lens through which I see some of this is in disability advocacy, being someone who grew up with a brother who had developmental and intellectual disabilities. And so I try to approach some of these issues and some of the things we're talking about today always with a view to true inclusion of everyone in the community. That's a term that's very important to me and something that from the disability advocacy point of view, I always try to keep front and center. So thanks for the opportunity to be with you all.
Thank you so much, Mark. So I'd love to, with our panel today, for the benefit of our attendees, our hope is to really open this up as a conversation, see where the time takes us, and we'll be providing an opportunity to welcome your questions as well. There are a few opening questions that we want to get started with, and we so appreciate that many of you indicated as you registered for today's event some of the things that you're hoping to hear, which will help frame some of our dialogue today. So as we get started, I think perhaps a good place to begin is board and governance structures. So we've touched on that just a little bit in some of your opening comments. So I'd love to open it up to start there in thinking about what nonprofits need in the middle of the crisis and thinking of both the pandemic and the fight for racial justice happening across our nation right now. So I'd love to open it up to see where you'd like to begin our dialogue today.
I'll start. Before January, when I became the organization's CEO, I served as our COO and Vice President of Strategies, which very much situated me in the operations of our organization, supporting our CEO, and helping to think about our future and our vision of empowered leaders and flourishing nonprofits and vibrant communities. And of course, the racial injustice and unrest that we're confronting in the last 5 months has pervaded this country since its founding. And so in some ways, to Eric's point, it feels like going deeper in a long and sustaining and enduring and systematic issue. I often will say the water is sick and we keep treating the fish, right? And so in that way, in my capacity as our VP of strategy, my job is to look at what are the threats to mission and vision advancement, right? When you're developing a plan. And specifically, where are those levers that we can turn or think about? And it caused me to ask our program teams about measurement of our impact. NEW is coming up on 30 years as an intermediary and as a service provider in Southeast Michigan. We've worked with, since our founding, literally thousands of organizations, and yet by and large, we have not seen material change in the conditions of the folks who are at the intersection of complex social issues. And more specifically, we've continued working with many of the same organizations that are having the same issues around board development, around strat planning, around fund development. And this idea of building capacity, which is iterative and long-term, should lead us to a change in those conditions. So as an example, the same number of people in this country are living, the same percentage of people are living in poverty as were 50 years ago. So even though we're a sector that sits right in the center of the social determinants and the other factors that influence poverty and race, we've not made great strides. And of course, the way our sector is structured is that we recruit, elect, adopt, and convene governors, trustees, if you will, of those missions and visions. And the IRS established that volunteer-led group, right, whose fiduciary responsibility is to make sure that we're keeping the promise of our missions, that we're keeping our commitments to our donors and to those who invest in us. And while that work is important, and I'm so grateful to have worked with so many boards over the years, I think that we know that the governance models and strategies have largely focused on the performance of the board. And it is important for accountability and to keep those commitments to the IRS. But how else could we be doing governance? The current design, its structure, the culture, the processes, they're not working well for us. And I've been looking at our colleagues in Ontario, at the Ontario Nonprofit Network, who offer a framework for reimagining governance. And that is what I'm excited to think about and to consider, because although boards are critical in the governance system, as we're learning, particularly now, the whole system has to be examined in order for governance to keep up with our 21st century expectations. And so we have to shift our conversation from how do we make boards more effective to how do we govern more effective. And that will require us really to reimagine the current structures. Frankly, boards are homogenous, meaning they're very white, they're very male, they're very old, if I may. The Building Movement Project just published yet another follow-up to its Race to Lead program its Race to Lead report. Race to Lead Revisited reveals that a culture of dominance, of white supremacy, of white advantage has largely left us no better than we were in 2016 when we learned that fewer than 10% of nonprofits were governed or led by people of color. And yet, the majority of people who are accessing our services are poor, are people of color, and represent minority communities. And so I think boards need to grapple with that. And I have been inspired in some ways and disappointed, frankly, discussed it at other times, with the statements that came out from boards who have not adopted structures to reinforce a commitment to equity with words and no action. And so I think we've got to take a look at that. We've got to really examine the role and the structure of boards to see if they help us be our best in our ways forward.
Randy, I'd like to invite you to go next, if you will, in thinking about that question. And as Yodit was talking about different ways of thinking about the way that we govern, I think in your opening comments, you were alluding to some shifts your board has made in that regard. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, Yodit couldn't have staged my comments any better if we worked on scripting together. So let me just talk about some very practical applications to governance. And again, our whole premise is generative governance and governance as leadership. So let me just give you some very practical things. These tips don't apply to a funder. They apply to every nonprofit. And I think Yodit's comments were directed at every nonprofit. So some of you, if you are struggling during this pandemic and during the crisis we're facing racially and culturally in America, I might ask you how many of you recruit board members by title. So I recruit someone because they're the president of the hospital or the college or a bank. That is a theory of governance that probably developed in the 60s and 70s. It's as outdated as the internet was back then, right, to that mindset. If your board is struggling today, I'm gonna guess you recruit by title. You think having A-list people, because someone has defined what an A-list person is, brings clout or credibility. I would challenge you, because now you're probably struggling because their commitment is not there. They're there because they're the president of some other company and it looks good on paper. But are they here by your side during these times to have the hardest points or hardest discussions? I would also ask you to question how much your board spends in the fiduciary space. Often when I work with other funders around the country, I see them spend too much time in the fiduciary space at a board meeting because it's easy and it's manageable. and I can come in and have a 60-minute meeting. I can get on with my day because I can manage a budget. I can look at your monthly expenses and give my opinion. That is worthless input at a board meeting. We rarely spend time at our board meeting discussing fiduciary matters unless it's layered with impact of fiduciary governance, not minutia of managing budgets. I would ask you to think about how many of you ever heard of the philosophy of agenda management, boardroom setup management or theory, or governance management whatsoever. So too many of the people I see around the country simply cobble together an agenda with no narrative, no expectations of how they're going to engage board members. And too many times, and this is a nice exercise I can give every nonprofit, look at your last 6 board meeting agendas, count the number of open-ended questions where there is a high likelihood of disagreement. After Yodit's comments, most board minutes will reflect unanimous votes in favor of everything because we're all the same people. If you're all the same people, I need a board of 3 people, right? So the last tactic or exercise I give to nonprofits, pull up your minutes. Tell me how many times you can see a strong disagreement where someone is pushing my boundaries to the point where we have a lengthy disagreement and dialogue. Staff people are trained to avoid that. They want to have a nice, neat, clean board meeting that's 60 or 9 minutes long. That's the wrong mindset. That came out of the 70s and 80s. That's an antiquated mindset. If you don't see challenging debates in a board meeting minutes, if you don't literally see questions on the agenda, literally written out questions that are provocative and open-ended without an obvious right or wrong answer, how can you ever expect to have a meaningful conversation about racial equity or the impact of your funding across racial lines? You can't. So board management, board agenda philosophy, governance philosophy, I see is lacking too much. And it's a major shift. It took us several years to get to the point where if you saw most of our board meetings, you would not recognize them. You would say they were retreat-based because we dive into meaty topics. We have to kick people out of our office when board meetings are over.
Eric, you mentioned in your opening comments, you've served on several boards, and including the organization for which you're now a CEO, I believe you were a former board member. So I'm curious, as you think about board governance structures and what Yodit and Randy have shared, how that resonates for you, or how you think about the opportunity for structure change.
Well, some of my experiences of being on boards were not always positive experiences. I was brought on because I was a person of color, but never really got engaged in the board, was never offered any opportunity to do what I would call decent onboarding. I was just brought to be a person of color on the board. So when Randy mentioned engagement of board members, I thought that was very important. I think that's something that we need to look at in board engagement. When you bring someone on as a title or as a person of color, as a person who has hopefully bringing some type of resources to the board, we need to use those resources and give them the opportunity, empowerment to be part of the solution. And so in cases when I was invited to a board under one pretense and got there and realized that I was just there for another, I would leave those boards. I wouldn't waste my time with them. I think that going back to how the board operates, I think we need to go even further back to what's in the mission. I mean, when we talk about what our mission statements are as boards, and we talk about our fiduciary responsibilities and being sustainable as an organization, we really need to look at being sustainable, equality, and having integrity, and thinking of all those things right now that are of value and having more than just words, but actions that go along with them. The boards that I serve on are engaged in that type of operation right now. Varying degrees of success, but the actions are now coming with the words. And I think that there's hope for them to continue moving forward, even as we look to try and diversify our board, find people, get them engaged in the right ways, and help bring part of the solution. We need to have disagreements on the boards, and we need to have different people to realize that there are different perspectives of life out there.
Thanks, Eric. You know, I'd love to build off something you were just sharing in terms of diversifying our boards. And I think all three of you alluded to this a bit too, as we think about how do you balance thinking about diversifying your board, but also being thoughtful about not like what I've heard referred to as checkbox diversity of we want someone who fits this profile and therefore like that's the style of recruitment, sort of like filling in the matrix, if you will. So I'd love to hear the team's thoughts about this. And we saw several questions come in from attendees and thinking about that recruitment lens in particular. So would love to open that up for your feedback.
I'll offer there, I mean, exactly to what Eric said, and I've been that tokenized board member as well. And I've also found that I've been invited to more sophisticated boards as my pedigree, right, has improved and the titles behind my name bring some sense of credibility, which means that at various other times before I had earned that pedigree or position or what have you, that the value and the lived experience that I bring wasn't worthy enough. So I think we have to grapple with that. I also want to be very clear when we're talking about boards, and kind of a nod to what Randy said, that we are talking about nonprofit boards, but specifically when we talk about board diversification, I see the sort of our footprint reflects the nation's nonprofit sector, which is to say the majority of these organizations in our state and in the country are small. They're less than $500,000. So let's be clear that we can't talk about boards broadly as though the CMF board or Randy's board or the boards of these major foundations, which also benefit from being nonprofits, or the boards of large institutions and the boards of healthcare systems, that their process mirrors ours. And in fact, they're very white, they're very focused on pedigree and title, et cetera, and they're often very disconnected from the real experiences and work that organizational staff are participating in. So I just want to name that if you've seen one board, you've seen just one board. And also that the larger these organizations become, the more white they are. So my clients are all mostly really deep thinking about diversification and how to build race equity cultures on their board. And we're doing the best we can, but we've got some systemic issues. And I'll just lift up to Randy's point about being really practical. Our boards often reflect our networks. So if you are working in a marginalized community and you're a visionary that saw a problem and you went out to solve it, and you grew up in this neighborhood and the organization that you've started, right, is serving this neighborhood on the south side of Ypsilanti, it's highly likely that your network doesn't reflect Randy's or mine, right? And the recruiting that we're doing, what we know is that poor people are surrounded by other poor people. And those resources, relationships, skills, access to funding, that's the other thing that we're recruiting board members for, right? Is an expectation that they're going to bring some money to our organization. It's not just, I want skill. I want you to bring a check or bring your network, right? So we are incentivizing this bad behavior because we see our boards as an extension of our networks, right? And yet not everybody, to my point about smaller orgs, not everybody has that privilege. We have a lot of centralized power on boards. To get back again to recruiting, so I'm a working mama, a working single mama. I'm the just past chair of the United Way for Washtenaw County Board. And we, like Randy describes, have been a really intentional, thoughtful, and generative governance board. And I applaud my colleagues on that board. But I probably put the equivalent of a quarter-time job into my responsibility as chair of that board, which is a privilege I have because of the type of job I have and because of my position in the community. But frankly, many of our citizens in our community could never leave their job at 3:30 to be on a board call for 2 hours, right? They couldn't not pick up their kid and participate. So if we want to really be involving and not tokenizing folks, and we want to be listening to the most impacted, which is who we ought to be listening to, then we've got to change the structure of our meetings. To your point, Randy, the meetings are terribly boring, and we're doing so much reporting out, and no one's energized when they don't understand why their being in that meeting is how we meet our mission. But importantly, how we're designing those meetings. We talk in big, broad terms and ways that folks who have never served on a board before are not going to have the greatest experience. And so we do end up finding the Erics and Yodits of the community, right? Because we can fit neatly into that current board structure, even though we also feel very othered and not listened to. And so thinking about the structure of our meetings, to Randy's point, thinking about what the content of the meeting is, and more importantly, thinking about why did we invite this person to the board, and have we created a board culture that really allows them to bring their full self.
Randy or Eric, your reflections.
Yeah, if I can always just follow you, Dee, because she just sets a big picture tone. I just love it. I've got probably too many comments for here. One quick comment, an editorial. I don't believe executive directors and presidents should not be voting members of the board. Later on, there's some questions about how do boards help their EDs collaborate. I don't like that we have to ask that question. So I'm a voting member of our board. As a place-based organization, you know, Deep's right, we're a little bit larger than many, right? So there's more complications of that. But as a place-based organization, I am a part of this community, right? I am a voting member of our board. So that's one point. Just in early 2019, before things really came to a head, we were aware that we had systems in our company, and again, we're a little larger than some, systems can become too much of a problem. We realized our governance system required service on a committee or a task force to be eligible to be on our board. Yet when we started to scan our region and look at people doing impactful work on a neighborhood by neighborhood level, they weren't qualified on our paper document. And that paper document had been around for 20 years with no one questioning. So as a place-based funder, as a group that believes we grow prosperity for all, we started in summer of 2019 asking ourselves, wait a minute, what does it take to be considered to be a board member? And the answer we switched to in the fall of 2019 is it does not take experience in philanthropy. And more importantly, Odette, and I know we're a little bit different, we have no expectations of board members giving us money. We want people that make a difference. And then one last system change we made, and we implemented this again at the end of 2019, when you are recruited to join our board, again, we don't just accept nominations, and we never recruit by title. But once you're on our board, we don't ask you to serve on any other committee. Whatever work you've been doing in the community is everything you need to do, right? We don't want to change that. There are too many boards that want to have quarterly meetings with minutes and agendas, and you push back and say, why are you doing that? Why do you have to document that? Why do you have to have a vice chair and a treasurer? They can't give you a rational explanation. And the last thing I hope we come back to is too much centralized power at the board level. I mentioned this in our prep call. We did about $4 million of business last year. Our board had a say in almost none of it. Our board is not the community. Who are they to tell the people of Algonac or Marine City or rural St. Clair County, who are they to tell them how to invest in their community? So we have a very decentralized governance model. Our board rarely makes funding decisions. But again, we have a different philosophy of what a board is for, and Eric said. We frequently, Eric, talk about what are we here to do? And one thing as a funder, and this may upset some people, we are not a grant maker. We do not like to be labeled a grant maker, because once you label us that, you precluded me from ever trying to understand how to make a difference. Because you say, all I can do is a grant. No, we're here, we're the fabric of the community. We need to change ourselves, and that's what we've been working on for a long time. But we're a part of the community. So there's so many tactics a group can do, large or small, to question what it is you do and how do you get people involved and what are those expectations.
I think a great statement was the why we bring people on board or why people join a board. When we do recruitment for boards for board members, they're interviewing us as much as we're interviewing them. At least that was the way I always looked at when I joined a board. Someone would invite you to lunch and say, would you like to be on our board? And I'd ask them to tell me about what they do. You know, what they do that's measurable, what they do that's going to be meaningful impact in the community. And that's how they're going to hook me. And I think that everyone should be looking at new board members in a sense of why, what knowledge do they bring, what unique experiences do they bring. I like the fact, Randy, that you said they're not required to have any expectations of providing resources or money, but we look at resources in a different way as well. It could be money, it could be time, it could be, you know, a good word that they talk about our organization. But I think the most important thing is getting them engaged, understanding before they even come on that we've got a place for you that you will feel comfortable with, emotionally and physically comfortable with doing the work that you want to do in the community. And if we get board members that feel that way, we can recruit and get a proper board.
As you think about that, that two-way opportunity that's coming, and I think you mentioned like the interview process, Eric, how do you see that relationship continuing then once that board member is a board member? So that, and Randy talked a little bit about that partnership, right, and collaboration. So how do you keep that mindset going forward, particularly when you know, you start tackling the tough issues together, opening that dialogue and maintaining that important back and forth relationship?
Well, when we interview people, we're hoping that they want to come on board with us because some of the things we said match up with what their values are. So when we get them in there, we have to keep them engaged. Going to a board meeting and my kid just said, how was your board meeting? And I'd say just that, it was boring. But going to a board meeting and not having anything to be engaged with, or getting on a board and realizing that all the things they said we were doing are not the things we're doing. We're really just going through the financials every month and going through a checklist. We try and avoid that. We try and keep them engaged in what we said we were going to have for them to do and give them an opportunity to share their experiences. If there's a time where we feel like they want to say something, we want to make sure that they have an opportunity to say something, regardless of whether it lines up with what we're doing. We need unique experiences. We need to try something new, especially during this day and age. You know, they may have been holding something back, but we really want to give them the floor and feel comfortable with speaking openly and being transparent about what they want to bring to the table.
You know, one comment some Eric said earlier, I cringe. I've gone on some visits with some people trying to recruit someone, and one of our volunteers, now this doesn't happen lately, thankfully, they'll say, oh, Eric, it's an easy job. And it just kills me. I tell people the opposite.
Yeah.
I tell them, Eric, this would be the hardest board you've ever been on, because you've never been on a board where every single meeting we're going to push your boundaries and you're going to push ours. Expect the most work that you've ever done. I try to overemphasize how hard it's going to be on our board. And I don't want someone who says, well, yeah, if you can do it in 60 minutes, I'm in. Then I don't want you.
Yeah.
I mean, along those lines, I think that because, you know, you mentioned, Randy, the fiduciary responsibility of the board, and I've seen that interpreted by boards as like, we're separate from the staff and the organization. And so as a result of that, the important relationships that need to be delved into and developed so that we can build trust and rapport to have those courageous conversations are often lacking, right? I mean, it's compounded now when we can't be in space together, right? How do we build relationships? But I've talked to boards that say, like, I don't even really know the person that I'm making this important and consequential decision with. I've never spent any more time with them than the 2 hours we're in a board meeting, right? Every other month. One of the things, I think that we're all learning the power of storytelling and narrative. And I was thinking about some of the questions that folks asked in advance of the session. And one of those was like, what tools are you using? And we've been using, and I've been encouraging boards to use storytelling and narrative as a part of a way to bring the mission to life in that board meeting. And we've, again, at United Way and also on the We the People Opportunity Farm, we begin every meeting with the question, 2 questions. Where have you seen our mission, our vision, and our values in action since we last met, right? And so we have a chance to reinforce those values that Eric is talking about so people actually see them being enacted. And board members can offer that, but often staff who are more proximate to the work will. And then the other thing we've been asking is, and it can be, again, values, vision, or our mission, right? So that we're keeping that in the center. And then just to the point of relationships, we are not, if our boards are majority white, and the majority of white people in my experience do not recognize being white as a race, right? And therefore have not had to talk about many of the things that we're surfacing, then why would we expect that suddenly boards would be comfortable talking about race or identity? And again, I think, you know, part of it is we exist in this culture where we're very afraid to discuss these topics, especially in the context of business. Most of us of a certain age have been socialized that you check your personal stuff at the door. You know, when you're in the boardroom, you're in business and you're at work. And so those important developmental opportunities to be in kinship and in relationship where we can say, gosh, I was not aware of the ways in which I was complicit in upholding racism or upholding other forms of oppression. And so another thing I've been encouraging groups to do, especially as we're more distant from each other, is just small storytelling and learning opportunities together. So I sat with a board on the west side of Detroit last night, and we just shared some personal stories with one another about when we became aware of our race. It wasn't training. It wasn't some process. It wasn't an assessment. It was just witnessing with each other. This is how I came into my identity. And we can all do that, right? And the other thing that we've been asking a lot is, what does it mean? When have you felt a deep sense of belonging? Because belonging transcends our identities, right? We all can think about a time where we felt like we belonged or where we didn't. So I just wanted to offer that practical step that we can take today in our next board meeting to begin really untethering ourselves from these ways in which we've been meeting that are not only boring the participants, but not incredibly, and I say this as a CEO, not really helpful to me. Right? Because I got to prepare all the materials and host.
Yeah.
I think collectively across the call, there was like a yes, absolutely. I'd love to probe further into what you were just lifting up around that relationship building, because I think what all of you have shared is is what might feel for some on the call like a pretty radical shift in the way that their boards operate right now. And so, you know, Dean, if I'm hearing you right, I think what you're saying is that trust building, relationship building is a place to begin. So I'd love for the group here to talk, if you could, more about like an entry point into some of these conversations. I know, Randy, you were sharing a moment ago that it was essentially a years-long process to get to the type of transformation that you're feeling now. Maybe if I could ask you to begin, what would you recommend to folks on the phone who are like, I want to get there, I love what you're saying, like what's that next step that feels practical or achievable for us?
Yeah, so I've got 2 good homework assignments that I like to give to other organizations, because what I would be afraid of is you running back to your shop and trying to engage your board in a very challenging conversation about race, and it's quiet as crickets because you haven't taught people that it's okay to speak up and disagree around uncomfortable subjects. So what I tell people is pick a board meeting, set up at least 30 minutes, and you're going to put on the agenda a prompt question that will be written out on the agenda that you will guarantee to have disagreement. Most boards come to a board meeting and they're trained to believe, I'm going to come there, I'm going to nod, I'm going to listen to reports, I'm going to agree, I'm going to vote in favor of the motion, and I move on. That doesn't create an environment where I feel comfortable disagreeing with Eric or pushing back against Eric. So I give boards specific questions. Put this on your agenda. And I'll give you one easy one. Who is your #1 customer? And you may only pick one. So in the foundation world, the best option is to provoke disagreement. The public, nonprofit grant recipients, our donors, our board or staff. Now, the other tactic we like to use pre-COVID, and this is an agenda management tactic that anyone can do, is we break the board up into small clusters and never let them congregate together. It addresses something Yodit said earlier, which is I don't know the person next to me. Because I come to a board meeting, I sit in a horseshoe, and we're very sterile. So we physically change that dynamic, and we'll do assigned seating, and we'll force them to come up with an answer at their table. As I said, that we know there will be disagreement. We're just teaching them how to disagree, and then also to expect at future board meetings, don't be surprised when you disagree with something that's been said. We will prompt that, deliberately prompt that. So boards need to change their culture, whether you're spending too much time on fiduciary management, looking over minutes. Our board doesn't approve grants. We did 600 grants last year. Our board doesn't approve those because that by itself doesn't prove impact. So train your board to be prepared to dive into messy, complicated subjects. That's really the heart of generative governance. But don't expect the first effort to go well. And if you sit in a big board section, a big boardroom where we're all around the table, expect it to go even worse because that is not conducive. It's the retreat mentality. Get into small groups. Let me learn how to disagree with you face to face in a small group where I'm not yelling across the room. And I'm much more likely to have an honest conversation with you. And she's training me to speak up and feel comfortable speaking up. So plot out, be specific. My friend Neil Hodger in Ann Arbor, I learned this from him. He plans his agendas a year in advance. He's plotting out conversation topics a year in advance. So don't just wait till the last minute and wonder why your board meeting doesn't go well. If you haven't put thought into what are you trying to do, what's the narrative of that board meeting? You can teach boards to disagree and to do it well.
Randy, strangely enough, when I got here 4 years ago, my board was constantly disagreeing, but not doing it well. And as an unintentional result of learning to disagree well over the last several years, we've become a better organization. But having heard what Yodit said about them having a deep sense of involvement, I want to be intentional about getting them to that space now, because I think we've transitioned enough and the timing happened to be pretty good for us that now we're at a space where we can have this deep sense of involvement and grow when it comes to race and equity and all those tough conversations that we wouldn't have been prepared to have 4 years ago, just based on the makeup of the board, what our values were, and how far we've come in the last few years.
I just want to add briefly that, many of these behaviors are driven around the dominant culture values that pervade our institutions. In other non-hierarchical, non-paternalistic, non-patriarchal organizations, non-majority white organizations I'm in, much of what you're describing is already happening, right? So yes, creating a board calendar is great. And Eric, to your point, creating a culture where we rebuff being perfect, or we rebuff either or thinking, and we rebuff this idea that because we disagree, there's a right or a wrong, that we're really curious and wondering, because our role here is to ensure we deliver on the promise to the communities we serve on our mission. So making you feel warm and fuzzy is not our job. We have to push through that discomfort in order to do the work that we've been tasked to do, which means confronting the ways in which we're upholding these value systems and making it where Randy or I or you have to cajole you into a new way of being. And the consequence, the downstream consequence of all this intellectualism and thinking about and process and this, that, and the third is that the people who are most in harm's way don't get what they need, right? We spend months. When I put a proposal in front of an organization, it can take 3 or 4 months for their board to approve it. What have been the consequences of that? Because y'all don't know how to have a generative conversation. So there has to be a sense of urgency, and we can look to community organizations, mutual aid societies, organizers, activists who have been getting frontline work done while we're sitting in the boardroom capitulating about, are we this style of this or this style of that? That is a privilege and a luxury that we get to do that. And a disagreement doesn't have to be a bad thing as long as you realize that it really is not about us, right? This isn't whether you like me or not. This is, can we get the work done? And if we can invite that curiosity and wonder, I think we could make greater strides. But we keep playing to the most influential person in the boardroom, or the person who we don't want to piss off because they might not fund us, right? And then we don't, and then we're left vacillating. So those are just a couple thoughts that came to mind. Love the board calendar idea, Randy. We also set our board meeting calendar out a year, and we place that generative question on there so that the board can be thinking about it all along.
Yodit, I think I'm going to put warm and fuzzy is not our job. I love that. That would be a great agenda heading, just to keep that reminder going, right? I love that.
Sometimes when I get fired up, those little, what are they called? News drops or whatever come out, yeah.
Oh, I've got a page of them. Elizabeth, if you can hear me, I would love to open it up to some questions. I can see our chat's been running full stream ahead, or full steam ahead. Could you share with us a question from the audience that we can lift up to our panelists?
Hey all, this one is from Tammy, and some other folks had similar questions on that. I'm going to read hers. You raised the idea of EDs holding a vote. I've seen situations, especially where a vote has been decisive, has put the ED in a position with a deciding vote, with truthfully upset a lot of its board members. How do you navigate that? And there's also a few more questions about how do you facilitate these really meaningful conversations? And when a board member is extremely vocal, how do you navigate folks being over vocal in these deeply engaged scenarios? Any clarifications on the questions I just asked? Great, go for it.
Thank you.
So let me just say, a couple of years ago, Neil and I went to Kansas and did a 4-hour workshop just on this topic, and we barely dented the surface. You have to get back to a philosophical understanding and a baseline of what is the purpose of a board, and it better be aligned with the mission. It's an antiquated system to believe I am not an equal member of my company, right? Because what that leads, and here's another very specific exercise I want to give everybody as homework. Listen for when your board members in a meeting use the words we or you. Highly revealing. If I have a board member says, wow, what are you going to do about this racial problem in this part of our county? That tells me that board member is separating himself or herself from the mission we do. It bothers me to no end. Now, I don't hear it very often. If a board member says you, I know we've got a problem. It's we. We are board members. We are trustees. But you have to break the mindset. Too many people, there is no training ground to be a board member. Or even, well, there are some for executive directors. I'm too old to have gone to a great school to learn how to be a nonprofit leader, right? I learned on the ground. But what we learned was wrong. I don't work for the board. Another specific tactic. If you have board members who are one-dimensional, you should all have a board matrix or an organizational matrix. One of the things I don't share is I rank my board members based on are they one-dimensional. If all they can do is criticize my budget, they need to leave the board because they will never have a generative conversation. They will never speak from their heart, right? So it literally is a multi-year process to break the constraints of what we inherited, which are severely flawed, whether it's racially flawed or organizationally flawed or governance flawed. It will take you 2 years to break through those. and you will have to ask board members to leave your company. And if you don't have the courage to ask them to leave because they are not bringing the right values or because they're one-dimensionals, you will never get to a point where I can disagree with my board. And if they don't like how I vote, when we walk out of that meeting, we're going to be friends and partners, and they may not like that I voted against them, but they will never criticize me. But it's years of changing the DNA of how people come to a board. I don't work for my board. Yes, they may fire me, but we're in this together. I don't go home at the end of the day and say, wow, I'm done with that, right? I live in the community, right? So it's a lengthy process. You've got to first break down the systems that we have in place before you get over the hurdle and you say, we're in this together. And I can see we're in it together because I can look at our agendas, I can look at our structure and our dialogue and know that we have the right culture and DNA. But don't think you're going to do this and have this ready by January of 2021. It won't happen. I probably missed some of the questions.
So you're saying there's no silver bullet. Got it. Great. Thank you. Eric, your thoughts on the over vocal board member, on the concept of the ED as a voting member?
I have to agree with Randy that it's going to take a while. It's a process of determining who's committed to the mission, who's committed to the board, and not just there for the wrong reasons. And it goes all the way back to the recruitment of board members and the why they're there and how to operate, and also give them some structure and guidelines on how they operate. I think that there should be more of a training process, an onboarding process that say what the expectations of them are. And if you don't have that right now, during this critical time, it's going to be some work to move them through. But this is an opportunity. This is a time to say, because we are in this critical time, because we are facing all these new challenges, you either need to step up or you need to make space for someone else who wants to do the job and who wants to be part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Yeah, I have found establishing some ways of being that we lift up. And so many people might know those as norms or group agreements. You know, I treat our board meetings with reverence the way I do our facilitation with groups. And if you expect people to behave a certain way, you got to tell them what that looks like. And so we have a whole process where we developed ways of being. My entire staff does this. We don't start a meeting without touching back to those. And we've developed trust over time where we can hold one another accountable. Hey, you remember that norm of move up, move back? Can I invite you to take a step back, you know, so we can hear some other voices, for example. And to Eric's point, it is about establishing what's important to us over time, which does take time, but I want to impress upon us the sense of urgency. And there was another question about vocal board member and one other question. I don't know if I heard that one, Bridget.
I think in terms of the executive director being a voting member within the board as well.
I really appreciated Randy's offering. I mean, my experience is that EDs are ex officio board members, so I'm looking forward to learning more from Randy about how we give voting rights there. Maybe Mark might even touch on that. I bet people would love to hear that.
You know, and one again, a little exercise for people with a really vocal member or a member who looks too much to the executive director or president. I had to have breakfast with one of our board members. She was a super sharp woman, but she thought so fast, she would immediately turn to me for the solution. So I had coffee with her. I said, look, can you do me a favor? Can you call out your board members on that provocative question instead of letting them off the hook by asking Randy? Because I never thought of it that way. She became one of my best allies at a board meeting because she was looking at Eric. I'm just going to pick on Eric, knowing that Eric didn't prepare ahead of time and call him out with a challenging question. Next board meeting, Eric comes to the meeting prepared, right? So I trained her expectations. Don't call on Randy to answer a tough question. Call on your peers. Push it back. Say, what are we going to do about this? This is a we problem. This is not a you problem. She was so thankful that I pointed that out to her. She became a phenomenal asset at a board meeting.
That reminds me, Randy, the leadership imperative right now is around emotional intelligence, right? It's no longer about managing butts and seats or managing agendas, but really our ability to be in right relationship with one another, with the folks we serve. I also just wanted to lift up that this learning journey and the urgency piece. With the majority of organizations I serve, racism is a root cause. Poverty is a root cause for why they exist. And so I think there was a question about how do we enter these conversations with board members. It is a threat to our mission advancement if we're not talking about racism, poverty, and other forms of oppression, right? And it's not about just the individual and interpersonal dynamics, but the institutional and societal impacts of that. And we have to incentivize actually working at the structural level, right? Instead of working downstream at what the water fish reference I made, and so that felt important to me, that our board members should really feel that, and all of our staff and community, because that's really what we're attending to.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, I'd love to invite you to join in our conversation, and we'll turn to you shortly. But as Mark's joining us, I'd love to invite our panelists, if you have closing comments, anything we didn't get to. I know there's so much more content. I think we could make this a 4-hour plus session. So I apologize we didn't have more time, but are there kind of closing thoughts that you want to lift up or reinforce in some of the points we've shared so far?
Thanks to Elizabeth for putting up this slide. And I mentioned the Ontario Nonprofit Network earlier, and they really offer an opportunity for us to think about the influences that are shaping governance. And so I hope that our participants will look at all of these levers, the external ones up in blue, right? We're a capacity builder. Randy's a funder, partner. There are other collaborative partners that are influencing governance. Of course, there's the management team, the board itself, but our beneficiaries. And so this slide is really designed to have us take a look at what are all those levers that are at play: economics, demographics, policy, these values. It really summarizes well some considerations that we might think of as reimagining governance. And again, I encourage folks to take a look at this body of work and to contact me if they're interested in further conversation. I'm hoping to create kind of a learning lab around this.
Eric or Randy, closing thoughts that you might have?
Yeah, my closing thoughts are that when an organization looks at what success looks like to them, I think what equity and inclusion has to be part of that mission statement. If they add that in there, and that's part of their success moving forward, I think we'll have some solid change that could be sustainable, as well as their finances in an organization being sustainable, or their mission being sustainable. That needs to just be part of it.
Thank you.
Yeah, my final comments, obviously based as a place-based funder and a community foundation. I think we have to be careful of putting too much power or keeping too much power in the hands of a board. They're just, in our case, they're just 27 people. Over these last several months, and I've shared some of this with the panelists, I think we've done some really powerful things to make a difference in our community around race and equity. None of those needed our board's permission. It's the right thing to do. We don't have an organization that requires hierarchy and red tape and their permission to do what's right. Yes, they need to be on the same page, but because they're the visionaries and they're the ones who challenge the norms, I don't go back to them. Our grant-making committees, our donors don't go back and I'm saying, hey, are you okay if we do this? It's none of their business if they're okay if we do this. And you can't just say that to your board without some history there and some culture. But if I look at Yodit's slide, to me, culture will free you up to do what's right, and it is never too late to start. So I'm not worried that my board may disagree with some of my things, because they will, and they should disagree with some of them, right? But at the same time, I'm not overestimating how much I need their permission to do place-based philanthropy and do what's right around race and equity.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I know our chat's continuing to populate with some thoughts from our attendees, so I'd invite you to continue sharing those reflections. I hope our panel here can stay on if you're able, if you can join in that conversation, or we'll open up Q&A again in a bit. I want to invite Mark. If you're on the line, I'd love to turn it to you. I think our team on the call has lifted up so many brilliant ideas and opportunities here, and I think you bring a helpful lens to the conversation too, and thinking about governance and what our opportunities are to really maybe think outside the box while still staying in compliance with those structures as we have to, but where we have opportunity to expand our growth and our thinking.
No, I appreciate that, and thanks to everyone for these thoughts. I mean, this is just a tremendous amount of information about how boards can perform at a higher level. Wonderful stuff. There are a lot of technical requirements, and some of this, of course, is rather short-term based on what's going on in the pandemic now. So what we have is a series of slides. We're going to go through some things and show you, and so you've got some takeaway tips and tools as we go through this. So the idea is that we will be talking about some board and some membership and some other technical requirements. So we'll get those going. If we can put the slides up now and talk about how boards and organizations can meet and act in an effective way, especially in the light of the pandemic. So the ultimate message here is there's good news. Michigan's law is very flexible. We can accommodate a lot of different ways to meet and act in the environment that we're in now. We're going to talk about a couple of these things. We're going to tee up a couple of questions, poll questions that'll help us understand where you're coming from and a little bit about how to meet your needs. Some of these things depend on the type of entity. There are different rules for public and private and religious. Some of them depend on whether you're talking about the board level or membership level. Some of them also depend on specifically what your articles of organization and bylaws say. You can never get that far away from your governing document, so you do have to pay attention at some point. So if we can put the first poll question up, the idea here is, what type of organization are you? Are you a directorship organization, a membership organization, or you're not sure, you don't know? So just a real quick poll here, if everyone will just take a second, and if you don't know or don't want to answer, that's fine. But there are a little bit of different rules. There's a little bit of a trick question because Michigan, besides membership and directorship, also has shareholder nonprofits. I think I've seen one in my entire career. But fundamentally, you know, we're talking about directorship and membership here. So if we can, we'll get a sense for what the answer is there and then move on to the next slide. I don't know how long this takes to get up some information here. But the idea is that we're going to start with boards because everybody has a board, even if you're a membership organization. Most of you are directorship organizations. Under Michigan law, directorship organizations are essentially self-perpetuating. Boards elect the board. Membership organizations have members who elect the board. The confusing thing is that directorship organizations can also have members, but they're kind of honorary, they don't really have power. Best example, last week I just sent in my renewal to the Detroit Institute of Arts. I'm a member. I have no say whatsoever in anything. It just gets me 10% off in the gift shop and early tickets to events. But a true directorship organization is the self-perpetuating board. So all organizations are going to have a board, and how do they act? The law, the Michigan Nonprofit Corporation Act, allows meetings by means of conference, telephone, or other remote communication if all individuals can communicate with each other. There's the key language. How do you exercise your fiduciary duty to discuss, consider, listen? Think about what the other folks talked about in the presentation here. Are you discussing in a meaningful, generative way for impact, not just for minutia? And that requires interaction. Communicate with each other. So if we can switch to the next slide, we'll see a couple technicalities here. It should be interactive. You cannot use proxies. Boards can't use proxies. That doesn't make sense, and it's not consistent with having a generative discussion anyway. It's not allowed by law, and it's a terrible way to engage with each other. You can't mail things in, literally or figuratively. Video meetings would meet this, so you can do video meetings, that's fine. Email only polling of directors won't work. It's not allowed by law, and it doesn't meet the requirements of the statute. So you just can't do that. And people talk to you all the time. We say, well, we just want to make a quick decision. We're just going to send an email around. No, not consistent with the board member's duties, certainly not consistent with the way to have a generative, meaningful discussion. And then, well, can we send a consent? Technically, yes, under law, if it's unanimous. There's no such thing as majority consent. You can't say we have 9 board members, I'm going to email it around, as soon as 5 get back to me, I'm done. Not allowed by law, not consistent with making intelligent decisions at the board meeting level. Consent is only allowed under state law if it's unanimous. I would suggest it should be rare and be for routine and ministerial tasks. If you have a new CFO and the bank wants a resolution to change the name on the signature card in the account, sure, send a unanimous consent around. You're having a meaningful discussion about the future of the organization. How are you going to do that without interaction in a way that some of our panelists talked about? So let's switch to the next poll question, if we can put that up, and ask what type of organization you come from. A private nonprofit, a public body of some sort, maybe an ecclesiastical or religious organization, or I'm not really sure. I say this because Michigan's nonprofit law is, fairly modern. It's been around for close on 50 years, covers most organizations, but some special types of organizations have special rules. So we just wanted to get a sense if they're folks from public bodies or from ecclesiastical or religious organizations. Ecclesiastical, by the way, in this context means truly church, synagogue, mosque, religious services based, not just a faith-based organization. So, long-term care organizations that are faith-based are not ecclesiastical. Ecclesiastical really means sort of a church type. So do we have any response on this yet? And then there we go. Most people are private, some public bodies. All right, so let's switch to the next slide and just talk for a minute about some complicating factors on a couple of types of organizations. So keeping that in mind, we'll put the next slide up. There are some special rules for ecclesiastical corporations and older special purpose nonprofits. I don't know if we have that slide ready yet. Yep, there we go. Again, Michigan's law is close on 50 years old. If your organization is older than 50 years old, it might have been formed under an old law, and there might be some technical requirements and you'd have to double check. If you're a church-based organization, there's some technical organization you might have to double check. But generally speaking, what I'm talking about today will apply to all nonprofits. Big exception, public bodies. Elected bodies, appointed bodies, this includes charter schools, by the way. The Open Meetings Act applies. Open Meetings Act by law requires in-person. There's no provision in the law for remote meetings. That has been temporarily suspended by the governor's emergency order. That will be in effect for 30 days after the emergency order. So you got a window here during the pandemic where you can do remote meetings. Otherwise, a public body can't do remote meetings like a private nonprofit could. Still have to have access, still have to provide notice, still have to give an opportunity to participate. You shouldn't put limits on attendance. There's a story in the news a week or so ago about a school board that was meeting and on a Zoom call capped the number of people, and that's not appropriate under law, and parents got upset because they got kicked out of the meeting. If you were doing it in person and you had a lot of people, you might have to move your meeting to the school gym and let people participate. If you're doing it online, how are you going to let people participate? You can't close them out if you're a public body. So there's a lot of access and equity issues here. So let's switch to the next question, which is, has anybody already had to postpone or reschedule an annual meeting or postpone a board election? Maybe, yes, we postponed it and haven't caught up yet. Yes, but we since did it virtually, or hasn't come up yet, but we're planning for it because of our annual meeting cycle. And I say this because we're going to talk in a minute when we get these answers up about moving to membership orgs in annual meetings and some rules, because the rules for membership and annual meeting are a little bit different than the rules for regular boards. So what we see is most people saying hasn't come up yet, still planning. All right, so let's switch to the next slide and talk about membership and annual meeting. There's actually a little more flexibility in members than there is in boards. You can do remote meetings, very similar language in the law as for boards, but members can also do proxies and ballots. Remember I said board members can't do that. That's because that's not consistent with fiduciary duty, which requires interaction, discussion, generative conversations. Members don't have a fiduciary duty, they just protect their own interests, and they can be as selfish as they want. So they can send a proxy, or you can set up a ballot mechanism. That's okay because of the difference between an individual interest and a fiduciary duty. I apologize for the size of the type here. I didn't want to get too deep into the weeds about the law, but there are a couple of phrases that are important under the law, and they say you have to have a reasonable measures to verify that the person is a member, and you also have to have a reasonable measures to allow people to read and hear and participate substantially concurrently. So access and equity issues here. What are you going to do with members? Are they going to be able to call in? Are they going to have access to the internet? You got to think about that and plan ahead. So let's switch just to the next slide here because there's a couple of practical tips. Prior notice and providing copies of documents in advance. What I see sometimes, which I think is unfortunate, is people switch to an online meeting and say, well, we're going to hurry up and do an online meeting and we'll just throw some slides up on the screen and everybody can look at that. How's that consistent with people actually having the ability to digest information, especially if somebody has communications challenges or a different way of processing information and needs time? You should give prior notice. You should provide copies in advance. You should have a mechanism for people to identify themselves. You might have to cross-check to make sure they're on the roster and they are who they say they are, but a chance to ask questions. This can't be just one way. It should be interactive. Some organizations have used the pandemic as, in reacting to it, have said, we just have to put off our election. We're going to roll over everyone's terms. We're going to add a year onto the term. We're not going to change officers this year. We got too much going on. It's crazy. We can't do that. Maybe that's understandable, but go back and look at your bylaws because your bylaws probably say what the term is, how many terms you have, when you have to elect them. You're going to be in technical non-compliance with your bylaws if you just punt on your annual meeting and roll over everyone's term. So I would be careful about that because if you start defaulting to just continuing business as usual, you're not going to meaningfully address what our panelists talked about today, which is how are you looking at development, true inclusion, and recruitment if you're just rolling over the same old people because you don't want to deal with it. That's really not an appropriate thing to do if you can avoid it. If you got to reschedule, but don't put it off forever. So let me switch to the next question, which is just to find out, our next poll question, which is just to find out, have people actually done this yet? Have you had to address having remote meetings? And have you done it in the past before the pandemic? So one option is, yep, we did them before. We always did conference calls. Yep, we did video in the past. No, we've never done it, so this is new for us, or not sure. So we get a sort of sense of who's done it before and who hasn't, and then we'll talk about a couple of tips to effectively manage some of the meetings. So we get a sense here, pretty much of a split here. Yeah, okay. Have done some video, only done in person, some phone. Okay, pretty much across the board. So let's switch to the next slide and just talk about a few tips on effective meetings. Plan ahead, notice, information, documents, testing the technology. How do you provide access to someone says, I don't have reliable internet, I don't have a device, I can't do it at this period of time because my kid's school schedule. You may not be able to accommodate everybody in a large membership. If you're a membership organization, you should try really hard to accommodate all the board members. If you're a directorship corp or you're talking about just board members, you really got to be purposeful about who and how you provide access. You might have to pay attention to quorum issues. Your bylaws should say what a quorum is. The default rule is majority. The statute allows as low as 1/3 for board members. I see some organizations that pivot to that and say, you know what, we're just going to decrease the quorum to 1/3 to make life easier. I don't like that because I think it leads to decision making that isn't very well considered. So do the math. 9-person board, you change to a 1/3 quorum, 3 people show up or call in, you got a meeting. 2 of them have their camera off, you don't know if they're paying attention. Something comes to a vote, they vote 2 to 1. You now have a binding decision of the board that was carried out by 2 people out of 9 and who may not have even been paying attention. That's not the best way to get to what our speakers talked about today in a truly meaningful, generative and discussion about how to carry out the mission of the organization. And I think you need to think about access issues. So here we are on a video conference that isn't captioned today. We didn't plan for that. You're going to switch to video conference. Guess what? Zoom and most video platforms don't have captioning ability. I've been on board meetings that have had sign language interpreters in one of the little boxes on the screen, but are you accommodating someone with a hearing disability? What about a vision disability? Well, we're going to jump on a meeting. We'll just do a screen share and throw the slides up on the screen. Doesn't help someone who's blind who calls into the meeting and didn't get the information in advance in an accessible fashion. What about someone who uses an augmentative communication device? Is that going to be possible remotely? So you got to think about that. Not to mention the fatigue. I mean, how many people have been on board meetings that went hours and hours and are just really sort of tired of the whole video, the video chat effect. So now our last poll question, I'm going to come up with one sort of practical suggestion here as we near the close. So let's move to our last poll question. When's the last time you looked at your governing documents? Within the last 5 years, longer ago, or maybe never, who knows? Or I don't know, not my job. So let's see if we can get a sense for that. And let me tell you the reason why I put 5 years out there. The last time the Michigan Nonprofit Corporation Act, the state statute, was amended was 5 years ago, January 2015. It had changes in it. So I'm going to suggest to you, see, most people have looked at within the last 5 years. I commend you. That's good. You're paying attention. That's really good. That's a lot better than I would have thought. So let's switch to the next slide and just come up with a couple practical tips here. You're going to want to look at your governing documents because you're going to have to think about some process changes that we talked about: quorum, notice, election of directors, officers. Yodit mentioned in the discussion maybe ex officio. That's one thing to look at. I tend to agree with folks and be in favor of the executive being a voting member. By the way, ex officio doesn't mean either voting or non-voting. Ex officio describes how you get there. It doesn't describe what your powers are. You can have an ex officio board member. In other words, the CEO is always a board member ex officio by virtue of the office. But you can be ex officio and voting, and I tend to recommend it. But the Latin term doesn't mean what most people think it means. But also, if you haven't looked at your governing documents in the last 5 years, or even if you have, go back and double check. There was expanded director and officer and volunteer liability protection in January 2015. It's generous language that can help protect your people in uncertain times. It must be affirmatively added to your articles. Michigan law is kind of weird. It says you may add this. Some states, they automatically extend liability protection to volunteer officers and directors. Michigan doesn't. Michigan, you have to actually take steps to do that. So review your documents, make sure you're up to date. So let's just switch here and sort of close out with a couple of thoughts and some references. Again, you know, these are challenging times. You're making short-term decisions to try to get through the pandemic, but don't lose sight of the long-term goals. You know, there are overall governance issues. What our panel talked today is way more important than the technicalities that I can walk you through. What are you doing to really have meaningful, generative discussions that are focused on equity and inclusion and really moving the mission forward? That's where you should be. You want to take some shortcuts in the short term. You want to move to doing video. You want to have some unanimous consents because you just have to get stuff done. That's okay in the short term. Don't let it take you away from your long-term goals of where your board and your mission needs to be. There's some references here. We'll provide them out to folks. National organizations like BoardSource and Board Effect. Board Effect was doing some free resources to nonprofits. I'm not sure if they're still doing that. Blue Avocado, which is kind of an online magazine about nonprofit issues. Independent Sector, big national organization with major white paper on ethical issues. The IRS itself, very compliance focused, but actually it's pretty well written and kind of in plain English, have good information. And then the sponsoring organizations of our event today have tremendous amounts of information, resources, tools, and tips available to you. So please see that. And then at the bottom, I've just added a highlight to an article that our firm wrote about the mechanics of conducting online meetings. This has been a real quick rip through some of the short-term technicalities, but I would encourage you to go back thoughtfully to what our panel's talking about and try to get through the short term with these tips if you have to, but get back to a really meaningful discussion about equity and inclusion and mission in the type of work you do. Thanks to all of you for the work that you do and for the opportunity for us to talk with you today.
Thank you so much, Mark. Really, really appreciate your great information. I know attendees had so much to gain from this and appreciate your flexibility. And thank you to opening up our webcams for our full panel. I know we're a little tight on time, but we would love to welcome questions from the audience. And again, there too, invite you to stay after in our open lobby for continued conversation. But Elizabeth, can I invite you to share some key questions that have come through during Mark's presentation?
Yep, there was a question about what are the legal considerations about including youth voice on boards. So the legal considerations about including youth voice.
Under the statute, a 501c3 organization can have directors as young as 16. So that's and for-profits cannot. Normally you have to be an adult, you have to be 18. That's a special exception only for 501c3s. So try it. But also keep in mind that not everybody has to be on the board. You can form task force and advisory groups. You know, you heard me talk at the beginning about how I come to this with a disability perspective. I have a couple of friends on the board of Special Olympics. Special Olympics has got a great youth leadership council. You know, they go after kids in high school and college and they get them involved and then they grow them through the organization and work them into other roles. So there's a lot of organizations that even if they don't have people on a board, they have some form of future leaders, youth leadership, youth advisory council. I'm a big believer that not everybody has to be on the board. Look for task groups if your problem's short run, like we need to lease a building and we need some expertise, but look for advisory groups so you can get people where they are, get them engaged and not burn them out. So youth is a good way to do that, and there are others too. But if you want to put somebody on the board, you can, as long as they're, and I think I have to look this up. They can't be a majority. You can have 16 to 18-year-olds on the board, but they can't run the show. They can't control it.
Another audience question was just asking to reiterate some ramifications around having the ED be a board member.
You can, there's no prohibition against it. The only thing that some folks you don't want to lose sight of is you do set yourself up for a potential conflict because, for instance, you're going to evaluate the ED and have a contract and decide on comp, and that people can't participate in decisions that benefit them. But that's okay. I don't think conflicts of interest are evil. They just need to be identified and managed. And in fact, I would suggest in some cases you want conflicts of interest because you want people who have an interest in what you're doing, but they need to disclose what they are and then abstain from the participation. So you can put the ED on the board. You can put the ED on the board as a voting member. When it comes time to evaluate and decide on whether you're given a raise or bonus, you just exclude that person from the room and the conversation, get the data, make a decision, and that's okay. So again, it's like any other conflict. Identify it, disclose it, be upfront about it, and manage it. Conflicts aren't evil. They just take some work.
And Randy, for you, since you're practicing that same setup now, is that essentially the way that your role is functioned too, in terms of just disclosing when, because you're an acting board member, there might be a conflict?
Yeah, so, back to something Mark said, one more indicator that you don't have great governance. If only a subset of your board does the evaluation of your ED or president, that's a problem. Every board member has a right to vocalize their opinion of my performance. We phase ours out with agenda management planning. We phase them out so it's not a 30-minute rush job. But we clearly allow every board member to speak up at different times about things that I'm doing well or not doing well. When it comes to the vote, absolutely I'm not there, but force everybody to have and express an opinion on the performance of the ED.
Great, thank you. Elizabeth, do we have another question that you'd like to share?
We've actually been hitting all of the audience questions in a lovely way.
All right, fantastic. For Yodid and Randy and Eric, I wonder, as Mark was sharing his comments, if any other thoughts surface for you, or if you have any questions for Mark.
No, great summary.
No, thank you. It was great.
Wonderful. Well, we're right at time. I'm going to say it's a lucky 3:03. Thank you again so much to our panelists. This has been just a brilliant conversation. I know I've got a whole tablet here full of notes. You can see on our screen the next couple of sessions that are here coming up, but I invite you wherever you are to join in a virtual round of applause for our panel. So again, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We invite our attendees, you'll receive an electronic invitation to fill out an evaluation, and we value those because they really give us a great sense of other ways that we can continue to tailor information to make sure that we're hitting the conversations that'll be important to you. At this time, we'll go ahead and turn off our webcams. Elizabeth's going to do a little magic behind the scenes to open up the opportunity for those on the call, if you'd like to remain, to engage in the lobby. So thank you again, everybody. Hope you have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Nice meeting you all.
Mark, you did a really great job, Mark.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it.
I was thinking, oh, I'm going to recruit him to my board. And then Randy, I need you to do some pro bono consulting.
The stuff you guys were talking about the generative being the keyword I keep coming back to, but it's like, oh Lord, if I have to go to one more board meeting where someone wants a motion to approve the minutes, I'm going to scream. It's not required by law. It's not required by Robert's Rules of Order. Stop doing that. Just move on.
Yeah.
I'm on a board right now where we have a motion to approve the agenda when we start the meeting, and like my head won't, and I'm trying, like trying to be present and allow the learning to happen, but I always I just grind my teeth, like, please, that is not necessary.
Now the only trick there is going to be back to the public body thing, because if it's charter school, you got some really technical requirements under the Meetings Act, so they've got a whole different formula. But it's like, okay, so you have a consent agenda and you send all that stuff in advance, and you take 10 seconds and you say, unless anybody has any objections or we screwed the minutes up, all this stuff is done. Now let's go to.
I know. But to be honest, like the more we engage diverse candidates, the harder the expectation that they've reviewed all of the materials in advance, I'm finding more challenging. So even though that expectation is set up, like if you're, somebody who's working a 12-hour job, 6 days a week, whatever, right? And even if that's not the case, I often find that still folks are not upholding that responsibility coming into the meeting. And it's kind of dog or tail, right? Is it that the information isn't really useful or invigorating, or the conversations are not, and so I don't feel compelled to read the materials? So then I worry that decisions are being made, without them being fully informed.
Yeah, and it's really hard when you have very technical information too. So you get to the point where someone's talking about the audit.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And sort of best practices is, yes, the board needs to see the, okay.
Yeah.
But you're going to have some people say, yeah, I've seen a million of it's fine. It's a clean opinion. And you're going to have some people say, audit? What's an audit? Why?
No.
Okay.
No. Yeah.
And it's a 52-page document with 17 exhibits. Was I supposed to read this before the meeting?
Yeah. Yes.
I gotta run. Thanks, everybody.
Elizabeth,
All right,
are we
appreciate
in the
it. Good
lobby?
to talk with you, Rodney. Great stuff.
We're not in the lobby.
Now the lobby's for everybody else to talk about us.
Oh, you're on mute, Elizabeth.
Yep, we're in it right now. The folks are listening. They're just self-muted.
Okay.
Oh, but I don't see their pictures.
I know they also don't have their webcams on.
Oh.
But just the one thing that we didn't talk about, this could be a whole nother discussion, which is how you rotate and include board members. I've had so many discussions about term limits and that sort of thing. And how do you purposefully get new voices? And then sometimes people default to, oh, no, we can't have term limits. We can never afford to lose that person. They're so valuable. And my answer is, and I'm a big favor of it, and everybody argues with me, because my answer is, if there's one person on the board that you can't afford to lose, you got a bigger problem than you think. What do you do about? Because you do that for 10 years and you don't have term limits, and guess what? The next thing you know is your whole board's people like me. It's 6-year-old white guys. Well, that's not really moving the ball forward here.
Right.
So I'm a big favor in term limits because it forces you to be thoughtful about the next generation of voices.
And you get rid of the groupthink that happens when folks have been together for years after years after years. I agree with you. Okay. Hi, is it Delisha? What go-to meeting is tough. Okay.
Hey, I think you're unmute. It's like a tiny red microphone, maybe on the right side of the cluttered panel.
I was gonna stick on just for a couple minutes if anybody had a question or for me.
Oh, Delisha says that it says we're muted by the organizers. I'm gonna address that on my end. Hey, try it now.
Wonderful.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that.
Oh, it's fine. I appreciate that. Thank you. And I'm well. I trust that you all are as well as you can be in this climate. I appreciate you sharing your expertise and your experience. I'm really grateful to be in the space. I did have a question about the shifting the culture in board meetings and how, I don't know another way to say this, how to get people on board to doing that when agendas have to be approved before they're shared with the full board. So with those pivotal or thought-provoking questions that was mentioned earlier, I was really excited about it, and then I'm like, I don't know how to navigate that space.
So can you tell me your role in your organization?
I'm the new executive and artistic director.
Okay. So what I'm hearing you say is that you are developing an agenda and then sending it to the board
The
chair, I would
chair. Mm-hmm.
presume, and then they're approving it or
Yes.
disapproving it. Okay. So, and that you don't maybe have the opportunity to add that generative question to the agenda yet?
I am learning that the culture of the board is similar to the challenges that were raised in this panel. Disagreement is not favorable or leaned into.
Yeah. So before I would add a question to the agenda, or I mean, that certainly is a place to start, but in fact, part of the reason why we even have a job at New is because directors like you call us and say, like, how do I do this? And so my experience has been that sometimes having somebody like Mark or Randy or someone not in the organization, kind of lift up what those best practices are, makes it less about you saying something's wrong with what y'all are doing, you should be doing something new. And it doesn't even have to be that you hire a consultant, but a lot of those resources, Mark, or web links that Mark provided in his slide and that CMF will send out, have, these are the things that high performing board cultures possess. These are the qualities they possess, or these are the things they do. So sometimes I might just slide a little like, hey, I came across and would you want to talk about that? Or do you think this would be valuable for the board to discuss, right? Because very few, in my experience, very few boards or board members are like willfully ignorant or willfully exclusive, right? Generally, it is, we've inherited this process and way of being, and we're just doing what we've always done. And so that would maybe be my advice, like saying to them, hey, I was on this webinar today and I heard some things. I'm gonna share the recording. Like maybe we even want to show the board a snippet, right? In the next board meeting, like, would you consider that we show 15 minutes of whatever really resonated with you today from this call, and then kind of get things flowing. And I generally, if I share information, I share it with a purpose, right? This is why I want you to watch it. And then the generative conversation, right? The question you could ask is, based on what we've seen or heard, what might need to shift in our own board culture, right? And so you ask, can I have, 20, can we have 15 or 20 minutes? And one final thought is, I have really striven to develop a rapport with our chair and to lean in, and that it doesn't always start that way, particularly when you're new, because that's who hired you, right? And that's who, so that power dynamic is there. So it doesn't happen right away, but I have said, can I have monthly meetings with you, right? Where we meet and get to know each other, that piece, and to co-create everything with them. So my board chair doesn't dictate the agenda, we co-create it together. Is that helpful?
Very much so, thank you.
Yeah.
I wonder if sometimes it might tie back into what you were talking about, Udit, with the others about the board calendar, because sometimes you might be able to carve out a little time if you can sort of get it on a calendar when it's otherwise a downtime, right? So there's one board I'm on, and it's pretty good about this, because it's like, okay, this meeting, we really need to focus on the financials because the auditors are going to be there and it's this time of year and it's whatever. So you know what? We're just going to have to dig into it. But the next meeting, we're going to go once over lightly in the financials, not even, we'll just send it out in advance. But instead, we'll carve out time to talk about the strategic issue of X, So you don't necessarily have to talk about everything at every meeting. So you might say, yeah, we got some nuts and bolts and business to do, but 2 meetings from now, we got a little free time, and some of that other stuff and the reporting, the grant report, whatever we're all hung up about will be behind us. So let's free up a little time to talk long-term strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's sort of like anything else, man. If you don't put it on the calendar, it won't get done.
Yeah, but I think it's realistic that boards should be doing board development annually, and it should be a part of that calendar and a part of the budget. And if you have someone, like if you had a Mark on your board, you could lean on their wisdom. But generally speaking, like committing a board meeting or a separate retreat to building the board's, competency, skills, trends, awareness, that curiosity keeps you looking at what's happening outside of the organization as well, and not just, navel gazing, right? Or only seeing what we see in our bubble of our organization.
So if I can ask from the other folks that I'm seeing here, what's the nature of your organization? What type of thing you do, and is there anything we talked about that resonates with you?
I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jim Grafton. I'm the Deputy Chief of Police for the Battle Creek Police Department. And I sit on the board for our local domestic violence shelter, Safe Place, as the Vice Chairman. And really today was just an opportunity for me to listen to a lot of experts. A lot of things that were said resonated with me as far as poor experiences, I should say. I came on 3 years ago, and there was a lot of turmoil amongst staff and the executive directors. And when I came in, there was no onboarding, there was no discussion. I never received bylaws, and I felt like I was brought in because of my title. And we work with them so much. I think that was a part of it as well. Having a law enforcement representative on the board was important, because we do work, we have legal advocates, victim advocates that work out of our department with Safe Place specifically. But I came on fairly new to board experience, and to be honest with you, I was disappointed. I was to the point of saying I was done. And because of the turmoil and because of some of the things that were happening, we were having long meetings, like 3 to 4 hours, to the point where I had to go to my chief and say, Chief, I apologize for being gone so long. But I said, I'm conflicted. Do I stay or do I go? And he encouraged me. He goes, stay. He goes, we need to get a board in there that can do, put together a search committee, get the right person in place, and move forward from what seemed to be the last 3 to 5 years of turmoil. And I can probably say that we've, turned the corner. Our new executive officer or executive director, she has been fabulous, great to work with. And she was only with us 4 or 5 months, and then boom, we jumped right into COVID. And she's done an outstanding job. And the staff has been a pleasure to work with. And we went from, when I first got on, from 13 board members down to 8, but only 3 of us exist from those original 13 that I came on with. So we have become more diverse. We have become more inclusive. And one thing that really opened my eyes was, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Calhoun County or Battle Creek, but we are in the northwest corner of Calhoun County, but we service all of Calhoun County to include some of Berry and Eaton County. Well, we weren't being inclusive, and we were not having representation from those other parts of the county and those other counties that we serve. And so we talked about it as new board members coming together about, we need to get to Albion, we need to get to Eaton Rapids, we need to get to Berry County and have representation, because those are populations that are taking advantage of the services of Safe Place. And so again, for today, for me, it was just an opportunity to sit back and listen. And I appreciate all of you and what you've had to say. It was funny, I know Eric's not with us, but people may not know, but he's a retired MSP trooper. And I've known Eric for 20, 25 years. So it was good to see him and his new role, and he's doing well. So again, for me, thank you. I appreciate all the information, and it was very helpful.
Thanks, appreciate it.
Gail, is there anything that you'd like to lift up or share? Not to put you on the spot, but I just want to let you know that you're welcome to do so.
Thank you. Well, we always started our board meetings with like a 10 to 15 minute, we called it ongoing education. And, you know, we might have one of our program directors come in and do, so we're domestic violence, sexual assault services. Do something about oppression or, you know, something about services. And when COVID started and we went to online meetings, so we're doing all of our meetings via Zoom, we stopped that. And I'm seeing the importance. We should be doing that still. And we've been focusing a lot on, you know, COVID and our response and keeping everybody, you know, safe, and our financials, which of course is huge. And after this, I'm thinking maybe we need to go back to that focus of our mission, our vision, and everything that we're doing, relating it to that. That was good.
One of the things that I'm always thinking about is how does COVID benefit us? And I work for really tiny organizations that have no budget. So anytime we do anything in person, it is a pain in the neck to like figure out multimedia anything, to like even show a video. It's all of us crowding around like an aging laptop. But now everybody's on the computer anyway. So you can just like put a link in the chat to some snappy 5-minute YouTube video about board development or like whatever the moment is, and everybody can just watch it really quick and everybody can actually hear what it says, and you're not like in somebody's bubble over their shoulder. So I don't know, I'm always thinking about what are the ways that COVID is making us better at stuff. Because there are some ways that it makes things easier.
I agree.
I'm gonna have to hop off, friends. Thank you, Elizabeth and Bridget. Such an honor to be with you.
Same here. Thank you. It's such a pleasure. And I will definitely be connecting again soon. I got the warm and fuzzy, and I've got lots of others. So I'll be circling back for the trademark.
The word was nuggets, and somehow I said news drops.
When you said it, I was like, wow.
But I'm kind of full of both of them, so it works. Call me for random trivia, and I got you.
Yeah, I was like, I need to like consume better content. I need to have news drops. Like
Little sound bites.
Edit that out of the recording. This voiceover nugget. I'm full of useless nuggets. There we go. Hey, stay safe, you all.
All right.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Take
Great.
care. Bye-bye.
I do have to hop off as well, but thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great afternoon and look forward to future opportunities. Thank you.
All right, thanks. Appreciate it all. And, you know, if there's questions that folks have after we send the information around, let us know. And I'm sure, as Elizabeth will tell you, if there's other ideas about other programs that people would love to see someone explore, you know, we'll talk about that too. So with that, I'm gonna sign off as well. Wish everybody well. All right. Thanks.
see you later.
Well, thanks for having this. It was really good information.
Yeah, I was really excited about this one. I feel like these conversations are happening from a perspective that I don't listen to that much. Or not that I don't listen to, but I feel like this level of honesty in the nonprofit world sometimes like isn't happening.
Mm-hmm.
And the nonprofit world's the only world that I'm in. So maybe it's happening somewhere else that I don't know about it.
So we had two members of our board on this as well.
Great.
That's awesome. I think there's a fear for the, or a belief that uncomfortable conversations means we're not doing the work correctly. And so I think that's where the resistance comes.
Yeah.
And because, you know, nonprofits are consistently, to some degree, fighting to prove their relevance, and trying to garner support, that just creates more rub or tension.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
But that doesn't make it less important. I mean, we have uncomfortable conversations about the work that we're doing, and internally even stating that, you know, feels wrong, because the board should be a part of that internal community. And I think oftentimes the perception is that board and staff are separate unless there's a working board. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've actually never worked for an organization that had really cohesive board staff relationships. Normally it feels actually like pretty antagonistic, and like, or like you think your department budget is going to get cut if you don't like have your PowerPoint graphs just right, or like something like that. And actually I've been on the organizations that I've worked for have had super skilled board members, and if I like felt that level of comfortableness, I would have been able to been so much better at my job. So I don't know, I'm just like, I feel like we're in a moment where everything's changing, and I'm excited for that to change too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Lasha?
I agree. Mosaic Youth Theater of Detroit.
One more time?
Mosaic Youth Theater of Detroit.
Yeah. You work with somebody named Justin Montgomery?
Yeah, he's a former young artist. He actually is a team member over at Y Arts. But yeah, he was in the program.
He used to work for me as a facilitator at the Adventure Center. I used to direct the Adventure Center.
Awesome.
So like Eric, me, Justin. And I just can't say enough things about that man. Gail, if you ever get a chance to meet a person named Justin Montgomery, hire them on the spot. They're good at everything. They're like a phenomenal communicator. They're really good with kids. Like they take feedback in like wildly graceful ways. I don't know. I'm just like in his corner all the time.
That's awesome.
Yeah, we weren't able to give him enough consistent hours, so. And he's an actor, so.
You're starting to hear the voice of a 3-month-old, so I think I'm gonna have to jump off too.
And I just have one last question. The links that were put in the chat feature, will those be sent out in an email?
To be honest, I don't know.
Okay,
I will copy and paste them right now.
I will. Thank you.
Cool. Sorry, this platform is really new to me, and I don't want you to accidentally not have that information.
Thank you. Let me.
I think it was mostly the Toronto one.
I'll just do a quick. And I have to get out of my full screen here somehow. All right, got it. Thank you.
Okay, well, it was super nice meeting you, Gail. Thanks for
You
doing
too.
the work.
Thank you. See you.
See you later.